Hello, everyone. In this episode of How I Stumbled Across Jung, I'm speaking to Robert Romanyshyn, and Robert is an Emeritus Professor of Psychology at Pacifica Graduate Institute. He's the author of 8 books. And the last one, and I think the new one, Robert, is Victor Frankenstein, The Monster and the Shadow of Technology. Is that your last book? And welcome.
That's the most recent one. Yeah. And the subtitle of that one is The Frankenstein Prophecies, because I think what I was trying to get across was that Mary Shelley's story was not only pivotal when she wrote it, because it gathered up a lot of the studies that were being done. Because at the end of what was it, 1818, beginning of the 19th century, there was this real fascination about we could overcome death. So there was studies on galvanism, etc. So it was pivotal, but it was also prophetic. And that's why I called it the Frankenstein Prophecies.
Well, Robert, I hope we can get back to that a little later.
Okay.
But firstly, I want to, how I stumbled across Jung. Can you tell us a little bit about your family? And I think you were talking about an event at the Berlin Zoo when we were having a chat.
Yeah. Well, I grew up I was born in 1942. And so throughout the early and mid 50s, I lived in a good middle class section of Brooklyn, New York. And my father was a hardworking man, 2 jobs to support the family. My mother was one who took care of the house. But there was always a ritual that my family observed, which I really look back on as the beginning of my education. It was Sunday. And the ritual began with my father around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, coming down the stairs. We lived in a 4-story walk up, saying, son, come with me for a walk. And a lot of times I didn't want to do it because Sunday were the days that I could play with my friends. But there was always something of a lament, like his voice had an elegiac tone. And he wanted to walk across the Williamsburg Bridge back into the Lower East Side, where he grew up after being an orphan during World War I. He went there when he was 9. His father died of in the war that had erupted. His mother died of influenza in 1917. So when he came back, he was 19, and aunt and uncle had rescued him, and he grew up there on the Lower East Side and wanted nothing more than to be a doctor. But there was no money and couldn't get an education like that. So he would go back there on these kind of walkabouts of Australia. They were journeys in sort of looking for something that he left behind. And so we'd walk across the Williamsburg Bridge into the Lower East Side. And I didn't have the words for it then, but it was an experience. When we got to the middle of the bridge, leaving 1950s conventional American culture, boring conventional American culture, in ways that I only realized later, very insular. We got to the middle and on the way towards the Lower East Side, and it was like he got younger and more buoyant in his walk and enthused. And then we'd walk around and he'd point out, this is where, I spent time here in the Lower East Side, etc. And then it was time to go back. So we maybe would spend 3 hours because that was the ritual we were going back to every Sunday. And I'll get to that. And we would cross the bridge and we'd get to the middle of the bridge heading back home. And I felt him just be crushed by the heavy weight of responsibility. Years later, when I wrote a story about that, in the story, I have a conversation with him. And I said, Dad, don't come back, stay there. Don't leave me with the heavy responsibility of living the life that you haven't been able to live. But that never happened. And I always felt then his sadness, his sorrow about making that turn to go back home. But we went home then because every Sunday around 4 o'clock was the ritual family dinner. My father, my mother, my older sister, Marlene, now lives in Florida. She's 86, so it's a while ago. My younger sister, Kathy, and me. And my father was, a hardworking man. So for him, his Sunday best was one of those, what we would call now muscle shirts, with just an undershirt with the stripes. And he was built like a bull. I mean, he was just solid muscle from all the hard work he did. And he would sit off in the corner with his Sunday best t-shirt. My mother would sit opposite him, my sister on that side, my other sister and me. And we would eat a pot roast dinner. And then it happened every Sunday. But it just kept repeating itself. It took me many years to discover later what was going on. At the end of the dinner, my father would sit back, smoke a cigarette, and he would turn to me and he would say, son, and he'd look at my mother and he'd say, Eleanor, when the kids are grown, I'm going to be a hobo. I'm going on the road. You'll be provided for. And then he'd look at me and he said, a hobo is not a bum. He was a wanderer, but he never made it. And then he would blow the smoke rings and it looked like a halo over his head. And in that moment, years later, I found a poem by Rilke, Sometimes a Man Stands Up. It's a beautiful poem and leaves his children, bids them farewell, and goes in search of the church in the Far East. My father never made it, so I inherited that from him. But then to get back to what they did, he would smoke that cigarette, he would say that to me, and then my mother would say, Pete, my father's name, her name was Eleanor, let me have a puff of your cigarette. And he'd say, Eleanor, it's the last cigarette I have. The stores are closed till tomorrow. You know you're only going to drop it in your tea. And she would say, no, Pete, I won't drop it in the tea. And they did that over and over. He'd give her the cigarette. She'd take a puff and, oh, I'm sorry, I dropped it in the tea. And I realized many, many years later, that was their ritual of like a bond, a kind of way of expressing some kind of connection with each other. Maybe even in some ways a kind of love in some sort of sense, a bond. So I grew up between the two of them. And my mother being Irish, my father being Ukrainian, on Sundays, they would tell fantastic stories. And like a lot of children, they kind of linger and they soak it up like a sponge.
Yeah.
Those stories that my father told about being an orphan in World War I, that my mother told about the death of her mother when she was 4, I soaked up those stories. And that was the beginning of my education, that you learn by being with the elders who tell tall tales.
Yeah.
That has stayed with me my whole life. It's not the linear way of thinking. It's more the emotive way of storytelling.
Yeah.
Like around the fire. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was part of the early education.
My father, his parents were Irish, or one was Irish and one was Scottish, but he wasn't a big reader, but that oral tradition, the storytelling was just so strong. I can understand what you're talking about. So, Robert, how did you get to Berlin, though, from there when you were a young man? How did that happen?
Well, my father who wanted to be a doctor, but there was no money, like I said. So he was an excellent carpenter. And when it was time for me to go to high school, he said, why don't you go? It was called Brooklyn Tech. He wanted me to get a technical education. But I was never interested in that. I was interested in the humanities. I was interested in music. And he saw that. And the thing that was most loving about him was that he didn't fully understand who I was, but he never got in my way.
Yeah.
In fact, one year, I think I was my 16th birthday, I came home and he wrapped this present and I opened it up and it was a bust of Beethoven. Now, he didn't know Beethoven from a hole in the world, but he knew I liked his music. It was a loving gesture.
Mm.
So when he knew that I did not want to go to get a technical education, he said, yeah, well, then you should go to the school that you want. And I wanted to go to Bishop Loughlin High School, diocesan high school. And, you know, it was like $16 a month tuition. And in the 50s, that was a fair chunk of money. And he worked extra jobs so that he could pay that tuition for me.
Right.
And I got that education at a high school, and I fell in love with language and learning. And it was like a fire in me was lit, and I couldn't get enough of it.
Mm.
So that started it for me. And then I went through high school. Then I got a scholarship, 4-year scholarship, all paid, to go to Manhattan College, where I majored in psychology, but took a lot of courses in philosophy, etc. And so from 60 to 64, I began my college education. I really just wanted to soak up as much as I could. Now, I knew nothing about Jung or depth psychology, but when it came, no, I was in high school from 56 to 60. When it came time for me to go to college, I had this dream. And this dream was a clear indication that when I went to college, I was going to major in psychiatry, to be a psychiatrist. That was based on a film I had seen that imprinted an image on me.
Yeah.
But I had this dream in which I'm walking down a hallway and I see backlit an office. You remember that frosted glass you used to see in old doctors and dentists' office?
Yeah. Yeah.
As I'm closer and closer and closer. Now I'm in college, wanting to go to medical school, in pre-med courses. And then I have this dream and it's backlit and I get closer and closer. And then I see my name, Robert D. Romanyshyn, M.D. And you know what my specialty was? Proctology. Now, I knew nothing about the dream, but I trusted it, or it led me. And I knew that if I wanted to study the mind, I had to get into, I have to use the word, the shit. It's like the old alchemical notion that the gold is in the shit and what we push away.
Yeah.
So I went in, I changed my major to psychology, and then I went to graduate school at Duquesne University. And after my first year of graduate school at Duquesne in Pittsburgh, I went because they had an innovative program that was begun by Amedeo Giorgi. And I had him for one class when I was a junior in college. And he was an experimental psychologist who was getting into phenomenology. And he gave one final lecture on phenomenology. And he said to the students, I will be going to Duquesne. They're starting a new program in existential phenomenological psychology based in the humanities and the European tradition of philosophy. And he invited me to come, and that's how I wound up there. So I'm in Duquesne. I finished my first year. I'm sitting in on all kinds of philosophy courses. I'm like a sponge, just hungry for mentors and teachers. And after the first year, I booked passage on an old World War II steamer, converted to a ship to take students across. And that's where my adventures began in Europe. And
perhaps we shouldn't go into all of those, Robert.
No. I just
no. What I meant was, no, I was trying to be funny.
There's some good stories. But stick on point here. When I was in Europe, I had taken with me, and I don't know why, but there's sometimes, like, I don't think we make the decisions, but life leads us, you know.
Yeah.
It's like psyche of the soul knows where we're supposed to go.
Yeah.
I love that poem. I think it's by Robertson Jefferson. I think it's him. I wake to sleep and take my waking slow. I know by going the way I ought to go. You know, that's a beautiful line for me. So I had this book, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. Never read anything about Jung. Didn't know anything about dreams. I was 19 going on 20.
Yeah.
And I had that book with me, and I was in the Berlin Zoo. And that's where I first opened up the pages in the Berlin Zoo, watching chimpanzees. So the instinctual life of animals.
Yeah.
Had Jung under my arm. And then I began to read Memories, Dreams, Reflections. I didn't really get most of it, but I was touched by something.
Yeah.
The way that was written. And that began in the search. When I went back to graduate school, I took as many courses in philosophy as I could, and majoring in clinical psych. And I kept reading, and I went into analysis then. My first analysis with a psychoanalyst who was analyzed by Emma Jung, so he brought in the Freudian tradition. But it was Henry Elkin, and he had a huge impact on me. So, yeah.
And Robert, how did you get to Pacifica all those years later? How did that happen? Because that am I right in saying that was the early days of Pacifica when you?
Oh, yeah. I graduated from Manhattan College in '64, went to Duquesne University. I told that part of the story.
Yeah.
Amadeo, who had a profound influence on me. And I was there from '64 to '70. I graduated with my doctorate in 1970. But in that period of time, I was deepening my reading and understanding of depth psychology. I first became very familiar with Freud.
Right.
Because the first one that I was in therapy with, the first person, was kind of steeped in Freudian psychology. So I read Freud, and I devoured Freud. I mean, and one of my teachers, as a parting gift when I was graduating, he gave me the collected works of Freud.
Right.
As a gift, which I thought was it was his copies, and he no longer wanted them, but it was still a nice gift.
Yeah.
And I began to read much more Jung, and I went into analysis, and my first analyst was Henry Elkin. And just to show you how the psyche is leading us, the graduate students wanted to go into analysis with Henry Elkin. So he decided to interview certain people, and he accepted me. He said, I'll take you into analysis. And I spent 2 years with him in analysis. Yeah. That was my introduction to analysis. And he interviewed me, show you how, when the hunger is there, you really go. I knew I wanted to study Jung, and I wanted to go in that direction, even though the program was in the humanities, in the European tradition of existential phenomenology. that's where I began to see that I had to put these two traditions together. So before Henry would accept people, he interviewed them, and he said to me, I have 3 conditions if you want to come into analysis with me. I said, okay. Now, mind you, 20 years old, I have a child, I am married. No, I was 24 then. I have a child and married. And he says to me, are you willing to give up your studies here at Duquesne? Without missing a beat, I said, yes. And he said, are you willing to sort of leave your marriage? And I hesitated a bit, but stupidly I said yes. Then he looked at me. He was a bear of a man. He said, are you willing to sacrifice your life? And I said, yes. He said, all right, I'll take you into analysis. And it was profound. It was profound. He was incredible. He didn't believe, I think, in resistance. He would just bulldoze his way through. And I spent almost 2 years with him. And then when I was finished and I got my degree in 70, I went to the University of Dallas first, because a colleague of mine, Robert Sardello, was starting a program in existential phenomenological psychology. So I went there to Dallas in 72, and I stayed there until 1990. And during that period of time, Robert Sardello invited James Hillman. And that's how I got to know James Hillman. And he was fantastic. I mean, I know a lot of people felt that James was brutal, but he and I really, and I liked it. He hit it off. And so I began hanging around, and we would chat. And at the same time, Ivan Illich. I don't know if you know the name Ivan Illich.
Oh, yeah. You know, when we were having a chat prior, before I had, you know, when I had my little countercultural library happening when I was 16 or 17, I had Deschooling Society. And I was speaking to someone the other day, Glenn Slater, who I think you know, and I was thinking, you know, James Hillman reminds me a little bit of the Ivan Illich. What Ivan Illich was to Catholicism, James Hillman is to Jungianism. You know, he likes to deschool it, and he's in the spirit of Jung, but he doesn't like the dogma or the institutionalization, something like that.
Well, he was another one of my teachers, mentors. I mean, I make a distinction between teachers who teach you, but mentors who give you a vision in addition to knowledge. So I count him as one of my mentors. And I met him quite accidentally. He was giving a talk at the Dallas Institute for Humanities and Culture.
Yeah.
And somebody said to me, he sat down, and the first thing he said was all these rich Dallas ladies who had founded it. And before he did anything, he sat down in the audience. He said, Robert Romanyshyn here. And people would go, no. And he said, I want to meet him, because somehow, I forget what the link was, but it was one of those fateful links. And I got to meet him, and it was fantastic. He, you know, he was one of those rebels, as you say, and so was James. And we just had, you know, a year and a half together.
Hit it off with him as well.
Yeah, in fact, he invited me. He would do these kind of traveling, I guess today we would call them webinars, but they were in situ, in place. And every time he had one, I said, why don't you come?
Yeah.
And so the first one I remember going to was when the Berlin Wall was being torn down. And it was on the west side of Germany. Then we could see the Vopos and the wall being dismantled. And he would gather all of these people together. And I was, you know, young, but I was on the sidelines, and I just listened. And he he took me under his wing. In fact, maybe to make the story shorter, he said to me once in the presence of Barbara Duden, who was a companion that traveled with him. Barbara was a fantastic lady too. He said to her, "This is the son who I would have liked to have had." So he found something in me, and he educated me. He's a mentor. Vandenberg was a mentor. We'd even count Amadeo Giorgi because he opened up a vision for me. So, and a couple of other professors I had along the way.
Robert, what type of influence would you say Hillman had on?
Well, when Hillman came to Dallas, and this is part of what you asked me, how did I get to Pacifica? When he came to Dallas, he upset the entire university, and typically, because
why aren't I surprised?
Yeah, why aren't you surprised? Because at the same time, I had invited my mentor, Vandenberg, and it was Catholic University. It was founded initially by a member of the John Birch Society, or the leader of that right-wing political movement. But it had shifted then to a great undergraduate and graduate program in the humanities under Don and Louise Cowan, really innovative educators, both of them. And so when I was at Dallas and doing the program, and I had invited Vandenberg to come, he had, Catholic University had written a book on euthanasia, medical power and medical ethics. And Sardello and I were called in front of the lawyer, and we were threatened with being fired. And so there was a huge protest, et cetera, but we knew our time was up. And the lawyers said to us, you have to disinvite Vandenberg, et cetera. And I said, no, I'm not going to do it. Vandenberg said, no, it's all right. And I said, no, but they're going to pay you. And so they paid him his salary, but they didn't go through with the invitation. And I had to find another place then. And
I just had a mini epiphany as you were talking there, that if you were hanging out with Ivan Illich and Hillman, and they were kind of like, then you must have a bit of a rebel side happening there yourself.
Well, the best way to answer your question is the old joke by Groucho Marx, the American comedian. He once asked him how he felt about this organization that wanted him to be a member. He said, I don't want to be a member of any institution that would have me as a member. No, I mean, it's, my name Romanyshyn means son of a gypsy. I don't like to be caged in. I need to roam free. And
yeah.
In fact, when I was at the University of Dallas, I had it put in my contract that I only had to do X number of dissertations. We had the doctoral program then. I refused to sit on any committees, and I wanted a particular kind of pay. And I got everything I wanted because I said, I don't need this. So you don't want to do it, I'm going to go. So yeah, there's been a rebel. Yeah.
But it's sometimes I think that great teachers are kind of maybe outsiders sometimes. They're not kind of, some of them,
Well, look at the example, James and the people who influenced me. And Vandenberg, he was an outsider.
Right.
And Ivan Illich.
Yeah.
And the two women poets who really influenced my life, Kathleen Raine in London.
Yeah.
And Elizabeth Sewell in the States, both of them Blake scholars. Kathleen, of course, the English scholar on Blake, far and away the best, and Elizabeth Sewell, the American version. They couldn't stand each other. So when I would visit one, I couldn't talk about the other. Elizabeth liked Freud. Kathleen Rain liked, well, she didn't like James Hillman, but she liked Jung psychology. Yeah, yeah. So I had to find another place, and that took me out to Pacifica, because, again, Robert Sardello comes up. He wanted to, no, that was the Dallas States. Pacifica, I heard, was looking to start a graduate program. And a man by the name of Charles Asher, who was the dean, invited me out there. And sort of like in the old Godfather thing, he made me an offer I couldn't refuse.
And Robert, was it difficult? Like, I don't know. This is what I get from Pacifica, that it's interdisciplinary, and sometimes there's an orthodox Jungianism, you know, of that's come through the clinical side, or the clinical training or whatever. Was it difficult to kind of
Wasn't like that when I first went there. No.
Right.
It was open range, to use an old cowboy term. We were creating the program,
yeah,
as we went along, and there was not the rigidity to the program, but it has turned into that, and I think it has lost something of its creativity and originality, but that's not for me to judge. But for the years I was there, it was exciting, creative, innovative. We had the ability to invite scholars, and James would put on these kind of fantastic lectures and seminars and invite people. And so that's why I got to meet a lot of the European analysts. We would have some money when we bring them in, and for me, it was a good 10 years. Yeah. A good 10. I think it was about 10 years.
Robert, just going on to you have an article that I think was in a book, Marked by Fire, and it's called "I Only Want to Be a Bus Driver." And the impression I got from you, or got about you from when I read that, is between the philosopher and the poet. Perhaps I got the impression that maybe you've been trained in a discipline or whatever, as a philosopher, and that poet's been breaking out all along the way. I mean, could you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, I think your question touches into perhaps the most essential thing about how, even as I look back, I see not the life that I made steps for, but what has been leading me along. And I began to realize that when I was in graduate school and I decided to not go into pre-med, but psychology, I took as many in my graduate work philosophy courses. So I entered psychology through the door of philosophy, and I've been looking ever since for the exit door of poetry. And along the way, given the circumstances of my life, especially like the unexpected death of my first wife, the abyss opened up, and I dropped down into the depths. That sent me back into analysis and turned my life upside down, etc. But I think in terms of the bus driver thing, when I was asked, how did you become a Jungian or travels with Jung, I couldn't think of any other title. And then one day that came to me, that there was a part of me, having grown up in a middle class family. I had this fantasy when I was growing up that my life would be fulfilled. Now I'm about 14, 15, and I love education. But at the other time, there was this other fantasy saying, well, maybe if I was a bus driver, I would come home, I'd have the route, it would be established. I'd come home, I'd have a dutiful wife, apologies now to
Everyone.
everyone. She beat me at the door with a cocktail and my bowling ball case. She'd have a meal for me, and I'd go bowling with my friends. And so that was the fantasy. And then years later, I realized, be careful what you wish for, as Freud said, because it'll come true. In one sense, that's what I try to say in that article. I have been a bus driver, but not literally. I have been taking the bus where the figures in the back have been telling me to go. And it's a movable feast of characters, but the ones who are always there are Jung and Freud and some poets like Rilke and some philosophers. And they're in the seat back there and they're saying, okay, you go here, you go here. And I'm driving where they tell me and picking up things along the way. And that, I think, was a metaphor for my life. Being guided by forces other than my own ego-conscious intentions.
Yeah.
Living in the shadow of the ancestors, indebted to them, and having not the work. I always said, like in the Wounded Research, you don't choose the work that you do as much as it chooses you. And that has been in that fantasy of being a bus driver.
Mm.
And when I retired, I felt it was very moving. Pacifica, about 100 people, a lot of my graduate students came who had gone through the program at Pacifica. And when it was all over, I was in the big hall at Pacifica, the largest classroom. And I'm sitting by myself. And off to the right, about 60 feet, no, maybe 90 feet away in the corner on the right, a door shining with light through it. And I saw Hillman and Illich and ancestors. I saw my wife who had died, Janet.
Wow.
They were all kind of radiant.
Wow.
They were smiling. And I had the feeling, I've done what I was asked to do.
Mm.
And then I was ready to retire.
Mm.
But you might think you're finished, but you're not.
Because of people like me, they come and ask you to go.
That is correct. And that's why I think I mentioned this earlier. I think now I can
relax.
And the gods say, Romanyshyn is having too much of a relaxing time. Let's send him another invitation. But I think I've done much more creative work now, post-retirement, 2015, in the last 8 years than I did before that. Yeah.
So what is the difference between the philosopher and the poet? And could you tell us something about Orpheus?
Yeah, sure. Well, in that fantasy, entering through philosophy and looking for the exit of poetry, and then the abyss, I don't think there is there's a semi-permeable membrane for me between the philosopher and the poet, because in Homeric times, in Platonic times, and post-Platonic times, particularly in the work of Peter Kingsley, the philosopher was a poet.
Yeah.
And
the philosopher, the poet, the shaman, they were kind of all in one with Peter Kingsley, weren't they?
And in the Republic, I think it is. I think it's the Republic, where Socrates is in dialogue. I forget who the figure is. The idea comes up, or the story comes up, that Plato, who banned the poets from the polis because he corrupted them with images and stories and wanted to leave it to the philosopher to educate them, the whole notion of the philosopher king. But he made one exception. He allowed one poet back into the polis, and that was Orpheus. And so I guess if there's a myth that really instructs me, it is the myth of Orpheus. Now, before I continue, can I have 1 minute break? Is it possible?
Sure.
To stop the recording? I'll be right back.
Just hang on.
Okay.
So, Robert, where did we leave off?
We left off with Orpheus, and Orpheus being the one poet that Plato allows back into the polis. And you had asked me, if I remember correctly, the relation between the philosopher and the poet.
Yeah.
I think before there's a kind of division between them, the poet and the philosopher are together because they both speak a certain kind of truth of that. In Plato, we could use the term anamnesis, unforgetting. They awaken something in us. And insofar as the philosopher was, according to the work of Kingsley, and in the Greek world, there was a kind of poetic dimension to philosophy. We know too, even now, there is what the poet is able to express in its language, his or her language, is a philosophic vision. You see that in a modern day poet like Wallace Stevens and the way he talks about his poetry. So I don't see such a bifurcation. And it's only if we begin to think of philosophy as having to do with rational thinking and logic and a certain conception of philosophy, then we make that division. But clearly in Jung, he always said he wasn't a metaphysician, he was a psychologist. And on that, entering through philosophy into psychology, trying to find the door of poetry, psychology for me has always been in that tension between the two ways of giving expression to a kind of remembrance of the sacred, of the gods, of the holy, of what gives us a boundary to our own smaller ego individual minds. The philosopher and the poet both do that. And they do it in similar ways because they resurrect for us anamnesis, again, an unforgetting of the presence of the divine, the presence of the gods. So you get an English poet like William Blake. Is he a poet or a philosopher? Says all the world is holy. There's a philosophic vision in his poem. There is a poetic dimension to the philosophy. So I don't see them as disruptive or broken apart. And I think when Jung writes in response to Aniela Iaffe, who had sent him a book on the death of the poet, and he reads it and he puts a PS, why did it have to be the death of the poet? And I think that's instructive. In fact, I wrote a piece about that. He said he was tempted. He was tempted towards the side of the poet. But he said, and he says it comes in the voice, a feminine voice, anonymous, his own soul. And he said, I was tempted, seduced by that. But then he says, I felt I would have produced only a heap of shards.
Robert, if I can jump in there, I've never really understood this, because when I read Jung, like I saw a quote, a day or two ago, and at the bottom of it said, the aim is not to turn people into sheep, it's to turn sheep into people. But his metaphor, he's just chock-a-block full of metaphors and the poetic mind, and it's lively and enriching, and I love the way he speaks, and it's often earthy, and but then in this time of the red books, the black books, or whatever, Salome came along and said, this is art. And I'm wondering whether it was just the time that he was trying to set up this science and psychology as a science, and he was fighting against that kind of.
You are absolutely right. I mean, I think my appreciation is that there was a kind of sacrifice that he made. I wouldn't say that Jung did it, for any particular group of people or something. He did it for the discipline, and he did it for his own work. That he had to build his psychology into a kind of structure that would be there. But he left us then a legacy, that poetic mind, and that Jim has picked up, which I have tried to pick up in a different way, making psychology into a poetics of psychological life and cultivating a poetic sensibility. So maybe he made the sacrifice, but he did it for the sake of trying to put psychology on a secure foundation when he was writing in the times.
Yeah.
And of course, there's the influence of Freud and how he had to respond to Freud in such a way that he could still maintain the disciplines in a Freudian psychology with going his own way. So
I've never known someone to come up with so many metaphors. It's like when he says, he dipped a hat into the underground stream, and he pulled a lot out of that underground stream.
Yeah, and he was guided by his dreams too, and so there are some people that who have really understood Jung's writing as having a philosophic intent, but a real poetic undercurrent to it. And one of the best writers who has written marvelously about Jung's language is Susan Rowland, the English scholar, colleague of mine at Pacifica for many years. And of course, James has picked that up, the poetic basis of mind. And there's a host of other people who have done that. So I would say that the philosopher and the poet, I cannot break them apart for me. And so in that context, psychology has been the bridge, and it's been a good cover story for me. Because if I've been looking for the Exodore poetry, I would never call myself a poet, because I think you would be hounded then committing a sin against Orpheus. Somebody else could call you a poet, but if you put that mantle on yourself, to me, that's the height of hubris. Right. You have to receive baptism. So I am content to not claim the mantle of the poet, but to be in service to a poetics of the psyche, developing a poetic sensibility. Yeah. And that's how it works.
Yeah. That's good.
And I respect the poets who have been baptized as poets. I read them a lot, almost like my daily meditation.
So who are your 2 or 3 favorites of all time out of the poets?
Well, certainly Rilke, Rainer Maria Rilke. And again, I have to acknowledge an indebtedness. I think one of the privileges to be able to be a graduate professor and have wonderful graduate students. And one of my students at the University of Dallas was Eva Spork. And she did her dissertation on Rilke and Freud. And I knew Rilke before that, but that's what sent me in that direction. Yeah. Eva Spork Sims, that's her married name, Sims. One of my other good students, Michael Scipiora, he did his dissertation on epideictic rhetoric. So he helped me to really appreciate the role of rhetoric, which was important for why Orpheus came back. He's in a line of, the line trembles. And so you have the gods and the goddesses, and then you have different variations of the poets, and you have the rhetorician, etc. So I've learned a lot from my graduate students too. And receptive to it. But I'm thinking of one thing that I would like to add that is very important, unless you have another question right now. That
No, go for it. Go for it.
I have really kind of learned a lot from my teachers, phenomenology. Al Lingers and was one of them, John Salas. And there's a notion in phenomenology that the origins from which we started are not the same to which we return, because in that process we have changed something. So when I retired in 2015, officially from any institution, so that's 8 years now, I wanted to donate my library to Duquesne University, where it started. And Jeff McCurry, a friend of mine who is in charge of the Simon Silverman Center for Phenomenology at Duquesne, I said, could I donate my library to them? Of course, he was happy to do that. And I needed to do that. So he arranged all of that to happen. We had a ceremony for it. I think the ceremony was, that was 2015, maybe 2019 or so, when the books arrived and they were cataloged and they were there. And my colleagues came, particularly Ava, Stan Marlin, Roger Brooke, had some nice things to say. But for me, I had returned to the place where I started. And like Eliot, you know the place for the first time. So the origins from which you started are not the same as those who return. We shall not cease from exploration, but all of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time.
First time.
One of Eliot's poems. And my library is now with the ancestors. And to me, that has to be. And it was going back and saying, donating the library, an act of gratitude and thanksgiving. Yeah. But also for me too, that those books, they're the living spirit of who I have been and the work that has called me, the living embodiment of the spirit of my vocation. And where else to put them? Could I have put them here in my library in France? No, that I have a different life when I came here to France, a loving life and a life I love and with a woman I love, Veronica Goodchild. But they belong with the ancestors. And that gives me a sense of peace. Now, at the dedication, Jeff McCurry said, how could you let go of your books now? You're not done yet. And I said, well, yeah, but I had two dreams, and the two dreams guided me.
Yeah.
And so before I went through with it, my dreams told me this is the right move to make, or at least how I understood the dreams. And in fact, so much so now that I'm thinking about my mortality now at 80, a whole new set of values now orientate my life, mortality, and a real sense of finding the spirituality and matter, nature. So that's why I'm working on this third book. And I wondered then, and I asked Jeff McCurry, I haven't gotten an answer from him yet. I said, I know I want to be cremated, and there are 3 places where I want my ashes to rest. Well, 2 of them would scatter them. I said, but doesn't it make sense that my ashes should be with my work? And he said, oh, I never thought about that. So I haven't heard from him yet. If he says yes, I think that I would like to do that.
Yeah.
You know, it makes sense to me. But of course, some things that make sense are just not practical or wouldn't even be allowed for some silly legal reasons.
It's like there's this great sense of, being guided by the dreams and the people you've met, and So there might have been like academia, but there's been all that going on, hasn't there? And then giving back, as you say. Like,
well, yeah, I think I owe a debt to the ancestors, and that includes many of my teachers who were mentors. I mentioned some. I could mention more if you wanted. People who have influenced me, shaped me, and to whom I'm indebted. But also travels. My travels, what I call my inner journeys in the outer world. And I don't know if you could see here, but I have on my wall pictures of trips to the Arctic and the Antarctic.
Robert, I'm just thinking, well, there's a couple of things I'm aware of. We haven't spoken about your book on technology, but, you know, maybe, who knows, some other time, maybe, if you want to, we could talk about that in more detail. Because I don't think it's like 2 minutes isn't quite enough or whatever. But could you, but the Antarctic, can you, before, you know, as a way of maybe finishing, can you tell us about the Antarctic and the influence it's had on you and what happened there?
You're a good interviewer. You pick the spots like little arrows. I go, oh, that's a really important point. Yeah, I had a dream. This goes back to, I'm not quite sure, maybe 2005, 6, 7, somewhere in there. And I'm on a road going north, and it's getting colder and colder. And I meet this old wise man, bundled up because it's getting cold. And he's got his head bowed down a bit, and he's white-haired. He's almost like stone. And when I get close to him, it's like you could hear the stone breaking. He points his finger, doesn't say anything, but he's pointing his finger north to the Arctic. So I thought, okay, go to the Arctic. But then, through another event that happened, a colleague of mine resurrected for me a dream that I had many years ago that I had forgotten but didn't forget me. He had been to the Antarctic. This is Scott Churchill, and he resurrected that dream I had had about the Antarctic. So I said to my wife, Veronica, I said, we support each other. I mean, like, she's on a journey now to Egypt based on her dreams. So I feel we're both privileged to be able to do that. And I acknowledge that gratitude. But I said, I got to go to the Antarctic, but it's going to cost a lot of money. She said, no, you know, you have to do it. So we'll go.
That's because they tax you in Australia on the way past, Robert. That's that.
I didn't go through Australia. So I did some checking. I found that to get the kind of transport I wanted and how I wanted to do it, it would cost $23,500. I said, that's a lot of money. She said, no. She said, we have to do it. And then a synchronicity happens. See, because when your psyche is in alignment with something that it's calling you to do, and if you're really open to that, the world does respond. So I went to check on my Social Security, and I'm sitting there, and I go and I see the official, and he said, well, no, for some reason, there's something on your Social Security. You got to go see this person inside, a special counselor. So I go in there, and this really nice lady, maybe middle-aged, pleasant-looking, nice smile, as I remember. She said, no, you had to come because we see that because you retired at a certain age, we owe you $23,500, and the trip $24,000. And
that's amazing, isn't it?
Amazing. And I checked with friends. That never happened to anybody else before. So I felt it was a synchronicity. I said, that is great. could you add a little more, 500, because the trip was 500 more. But that's what paid for the trip. Yeah, that piece of synchronicity. And the Antarctic, when I was there, John, I've been to 3 places in my life where I felt the gods were still present. You know, there's that passage in Heidegger about it's the midnight of the world and the gods have fled. But you can still feel them. If you don't like the term gods, there is a sense of the anima mundi really throbbing and beating in these places yet. One of them is the Outer Hebrides on the island of Staffa. The other one was the African bush in the Umfolozi. But the third was the Antarctic. Because when I got there, I knew this is what Heidegger meant. This is where the gods still were. And it changed my life. And in fact, when I came back, I had to make a little video. It's about 30 minutes of images and music that this composer friend of mine wrote and a voiceover. And you're in that ice, and they're like crystal cathedrals. It's like a holy sanctuary.
Right.
That was one powerful experience among the many, but there's one when I was in the Antarctic that two, when I was taking these little trips from the boat onto the ice itself, I saw this when we were leaving. I don't think I have it here, but a picture that I took of the ice, and it's shaped like a heart or a womb.
Right.
And that's on my website. You could see it. And it was like the parting gift, a birthing place.
Right.
But I also felt that this is the canary in the coal mine, because the Arctic ice is melting, and that inspired a lot of my work.
Yeah.
Post that. And then the other thing was, I was standing on a hilltop looking at the horizon, and where the sky and the land meet in the Antarctic. And because where you have the ice and the sun, it's alchemically, they produce a kind of fire. Well, it was a low fire, there was mist, so it was like this meeting of earth and sky, of ice and clouds, however you want to say it. I saw that, and I suddenly was drawn into that place. And for maybe the 3rd time in my life, I felt dissolved into the all. I became the very thing I've been writing about how we've broken our bonds with nature. It was like what Freud calls the oceanic feeling. It wasn't me in the horizon. It wasn't me in the ice. That all dissolved. There was no barrier, no distinction.
Yeah.
And it was a holy moment. Yeah, a sacred moment. That was the Antarctic for me.
That's a beautiful story, Robert. I think maybe that's a good place to finish there. But that that's a powerful and a beautiful story.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thanks for sharing so much of your story, you know, and the people you've met along the way, and it's been you know, I get synchronicity when I think about you. Like, you know, so many kind of synchronistic events have happened along the way, and you must have been open to them, you know.
I think when I did the book on the wounded researcher, I wrote in there concerning research, the way I've lived my life. We are not the makers of our life. We're agents in service to something else. And so you got to pay attention to the dreams, what happens along the way. And I've had a lot of it. What I would call the miracles in the mundane happen like that to me.
And that's what some people call religious. You know, back before religious became an institutional idea.
Yeah, yeah. Von Franz, in fact, says something very similar when that happens, when these synchronicities happen. And they're healing, you know, when you are, when we hear that broken bond with nature, you know. So, yeah.
Well, Robert, thank you.
Listen, John, thank you. You're an excellent host. I really appreciate it. I can't thank you enough. So, and it's been a pleasure to meet you. And I hope our paths cross again, either in Western Australia or in France or the Antarctic.
I hope so as well. Or in the Antarctic, okay?
All right.
See you later.